here.
Yes.
I'm ready.
There.
Have you ever had that feeling when you've sort of always never been really enjoying doing something and a bit unhappy about it, but you've never really analysed that until one day you realise that it's just because that thing was horrible. And one day you realise what was wrong with it. And then you can't sort of unsee that. And you don't like it anymore. And you wish it was better. This talk is about that feeling. Right? That's where this comes from. That feeling about API docs. I'm Peter Hilton. I have a Twitter account. It makes me happy if you'll follow me on Twitter. So please do that. I have a website, which means I don't have to introduce myself. So if you really did want to know more, then go to the website. There's things about me there. I guess what's relevant for this talk is that I've done lots of web app development, server-side, with APIs and HTTP stuff. So this is an HTTP talk. I'm not a PHP developer. I mostly did my stuff in other languages. Although to be fair, I was walking over here this evening and I realized that I think the third version of my personal homepage was built in PHP 3, which was the current version at the time. That was some years ago. Okay. So this is because this presentation is because I want two things. I want docs to be good, and I want APIs to be good. And these are really the same thing. They're part of the same thing. So what's a bit different now in software than say 15 years ago is that these days user experience is a thing. It's not controversial to say maybe usability should not be rubbish. Developer experience should be a thing too, because let's face it, developers are people too. So we too deserve a nice experience when we use software. And these are two of the things that will contribute to a positive rather than a sad developer experience when writing APIs and using APIs. So that's my motivation. That's what I want out of this. And these are the things that I've not always had. Now, the introduction to where I'm going with this comes from deconstructing APIs, which is a thing it turns out we do. And for me, this was the insight that what we do is when we get APIs, we chop them up into little bits and pull these bits apart. We deconstruct them. And I'm not entirely sure why we do this, but once I recognized that we do this, it gave me some ideas. So we're used to APIs being documented a bit like this. So it's not about the content, so don't worry if you don't read Japanese. But the structure is sort of familiar. This is what API docs sort of look like. There's lots of bits of information that are separated and each put in their separate place. But when you use this, when you write code, when you want a random number, you just do one thing. You just have a line of code. That line of code is not shown here, incidentally. I mean, it would be lower down because this is nice documentation and it has examples. But in the first instance, we put that last. We somehow put all this other structured stuff first. It's just what we do. It's just how we think about APIs and code. So we don't always do that. At least non-programmers don't do that, also known as normal people. This is one of my favorite phrase books, which is a little thing. It's about this big. And it's a special purpose phrase book, English phrase book, for making friends. So it's a phrase book for social situations in English. It's quite good fun. Here's one of the pages. This is page 27. I think it's page 27. It is. This is a scenario, I think it's at a party, when Mark wants to introduce his Spanish friend Raul to some of his friends. Okay? And there's a sort of dialogue going on. And being a phrase book, it's highlighted in bold the key parts of the conversation. Now, if you're learning to do this conversation, this is a kind of useful thing because it shows you how to do it, it shows you how it works with a concrete example, and it highlights key elements. Is this how, as developers, we write API documentation? No, it is not.
This is how we meet people.
Yeah, no. So if developers wrote this phrase book, it would look like this. You see. We would have documentation for this introduce method. And you've got to name the parameters. Now, I know naming is hard, but having thought about this long and hard, I've decided that when you get somebody who you introduce somebody else, then you obviously have a subject and a target. So I have to invent some new abstractions in order to be able to document this interaction. And refer to kind of related things. So what I've done here is I've deconstructed the conversation into its parts and made it like API documentation. Unfortunately, this no longer shows you how to have the conversation. You cannot, from this, see how to have the conversation. This is no help if you want to actually introduce somebody to somebody at a party. But it's what we're used to. So why do we do this? Well, a clue comes from this picture. So I like flowers because they're pretty, colourful in this case, sometimes they smell nice. And this is nice, but as a programmer, I must say that this makes me feel really quite happy inside. This is the deconstructed version of the bunch of flowers. And very, very satisfying. It's neat and tidy. Oh, I have a question about it.
Quick question. Did you shot those pictures yourself? Did you make this?
No. So this is the work of Swiss artist Ursus Verli from his book Kunst aufzuräumen, which I highly recommend. It's genius work of art. I mean, you can see here what he did with a little and ketchup. It's a whole book of deconstructed things, and the whole thing is indeed extremely satisfying. I should also mention that this is the sequel. This is the sequel to his earlier book, Kunst aufräumen, where he takes well-known works of art and then he kind of redraws them to be tidy. You know that one with Frank Vogt has this sort of bedroom and it's a bit messy, so he tidies up Frank Vogt's bedroom. Everything's like lined up and neat and tidy. Also very satisfying. Bizarre. I mean, I'm just assuming this guy is a programmer. Obviously, it just must be. So I guess we do this because it's satisfying. It's somehow, this deconstruction is somehow satisfying, and so I sort of get that. I kind of assume who writes code? I didn't check. Maybe I should check this. Okay, not everybody's got a hand up. I assume you're just shy. Who writes documentation? Okay, keep your hand up if you like it. Not one or two. Okay, well, new friends, because I too love documentation. Writing documentation is really great. But I understand that not everybody likes doing it. But one of the nice things about writing documentation is that you can deconstruct things, produce things like this, and it's very satisfying. It is. It's nice. It gives me a warm feeling. Writing docs is my zen. So what's wrong with this? I mean, in PHP, in this page from the Russian manual example, I mean, this is kind of the right thing to do. So I don't actually have any criticism of this. However, things have changed. What's changed is that HTTP has sort of taken over all of the things. It's this sort of long-term trend. And so all of these old things sort of still exist, but in a new HTTP-based version. Everything's kind of been web-enabled, right? And this is, on the whole, an extremely good thing. I mean, I totally do not miss CD-ROMs, which were like web pages that wouldn't load, and every single one had completely reinvented user interface, and you couldn't find the scroll bars, let alone figure out how to use them. Although, to be fair, the web's going that way as well, which is that's good. So there's all these web things, and all of these web things have APIs, and all of these APIs need docs too. So we have API docs. The problem with API docs is that they are all long. This is the thing that's been annoying me. So I figured out why they're wrong, because as developers who write docs, we like to deconstruct things. So let's start with an example. Let's suppose you want one of these. Thank you, Daniel, for the sound effects. I didn't plug in the audio, but just somehow it still works. So obviously, some days you just need a random GIF. Random GIF. Where do you get a random GIF? You go to the Giphy.com API random endpoint, which gives you a random GIF, which, let's face it, is probably cat related. This is highly structured documentation. Everything's in a box. Programmers love boxes, as do cats. Not a coincidence. So everything's been chopped up into these separate little boxes and organized. This is very tiny and organized, right? And this is deconstruction in practice. So what's happened here is that this is an endpoint in an HTTP API where you will send your HTTP request. And your HTTP request will consist of various things that in this documentation have all been deconstructed and pulled apart, separated from each other. Some of them, such as what does the example response actually look like, are not even on this webpage. That's somewhere else. I've got a sort of abstract version of it here. Data, colon, object, square bracket. Don't think that's what I see in the response, but it's somehow related. Okay? So this is sort of normal for API docs. And I chose this, among other reasons, apart from the fact that this is one of the most important APIs there is. The most important one comes later, actually. Is that this is pretty good docs. I mean, this is pretty good. Here's another example, the GitHub API for creating a new GitHub repo. So these docs are a bit more complex. It's a more complex API. There's more complex parameters. So there's a whole kind of table of input parameters here, whole sort of data model here, data dictionary. It's got examples as well. So this is actually much nicer because it gives me this example response. Of course, the example response is just so they don't have to document this list of properties here. They're just unexplained. They just are. That's what you get. So we've got more stuff here. I mean, there's more things. It's zoomed out more, so you're even less able to read this text. It's bigger, but bigger is usually better. But there are more things that are explained elsewhere. That kind of makes sense they're explained elsewhere because this API has lots of these resources, lots of HTTP resources, and all of them do these things the same way. So they all have the same kind of error handling. So I guess from the point of view of the technical writer making this, for maximum satisfaction, everything is completely structured. There is no duplication. Everything is in the right place. This means that if you want to know the error handling here, you have to go somewhere else. So as a reader, you're basically not having the nicest developer experience. But this is about as good as API docs get, I think. This is super good stuff. But it's not as good as it could be. So what I think is better is flat documentation. I came to the realization that flat design is not just for user interfaces. So what I mean by that is there was a time when on user interfaces, buttons all looked like fake 3D and clickable things were supposed to look clickable. We totally don't do that anymore. Now every web page is a game where you have to hunt the things that you can click by scrubbing the whole thing with a mouse until something highlights. So much fun. I love that. Everybody loves that, surely. So I want to introduce a very simple idea about a slightly different way to do things. So this is about an approach to documentation. Now, before you ask, you cannot generate the stuff, and this is not about docs generation, because at this point, somebody is going to stick their hand up, and I'm sorry, but there is no such thing as generated documentation. No such thing. You can generate page layout, you can generate style and structure, but you cannot generate words and spaces. I think that's what we'd call a hard AI problem, to look at your code and then write English sentences that explain what and how and why. So that's not happening anytime soon. So I'm talking about the stuff you can't generate. Maybe you could do some, but that's really not what I'm focusing on. So my starting point is my current favorite HTTP client tool. It's kind of like curl, but with good user experience, good developer experience. It's called HTTPy. Who's heard of HTTPy? Do you like it? Non-committal. It's great. I love it. Your mind may vary apparently. It's nice because it's got a fairly simple syntax for doing kind of requests. And so you say HTTP post URL and give it some data and it posts it to that URL. Nobody can ever remember the command line options to do this in curl and has to look it up in the man page every single time. So basically the win of this tool is that you don't have to open the man page every single time you use it.
It's not a real auth, is it?
No, of course it's not my radar.
Because you're on YouTube.
Yes, no. For people watching at home, that is not my real authentication.
Not anymore.
So when you run this command line, what it does is it gives you a literal raw HTTP session, because I said verbose. If I hadn't given it the verbose switch, it would have just given me the response. But here I get all of the request headers and the request body, and then it gives me the response status line and response headers, and I keep going, lots and lots of headers, response body, and there's lots of that. That sort of goes on forever. Who's familiar with what this stuff looks like? This is HTTP headers, body, request line. Okay, yeah, I'm in the right place. So this is familiar stuff, and that's the first key insight. I don't have to explain this. If you're a web developer, sooner or later, this is fairly normal, the syntax at least. I mean, what on earth this particular header is, who even knows, but that's a different problem. So there's quite a lot of this. This is the output from the raw session. It's mainly the response body starts here. So it's mainly the response body. It's quite big. If I sort of chop this up a bit, this is sort of the original headers, request headers and response headers. But if I'm trying to use an API, I don't really need all of these. So if I remove the ones that aren't interesting for me as a user of the API, I'm left with these. This is quite a concise representation of how things work. Okay. If I were to take this and then add a title and a short description, which I just copied from the original documentation, then I get this kind of title and then the literal session, slightly filtered. And I've got all of the same stuff, but it's much closer together. Nothing's elsewhere, not really. And it's not deconstructed. And this is actually quite nice. There's a lot of advantages to this because you don't have to kind of figure out how to relate it to an HTTP request because it is the HTTP request. You don't have to go looking like, oh, where does it specify, what authorization do I use or whatever. I mean, all of the stuff is kind of right there. Now, that's sort of partly true, but at least this is my starting point. So where can we go from here? So if I zoom in, just look at the request. And I can say it's the request, I guess. That looks nice. And use color, because I'm a designer. If I'm looking at this and I'm trying to kind of claim that this is my documentation for the API, I realize that this doesn't quite work. Because if you look at this, you have questions. I mean, it tells you some things, but for example, authorization, basic, and also not my password. Smart. But there's something I can do about this. So what I can do here is that I can sort of add a table of the parameters, and I can say, okay, there's an authorization parameter. It's a header, authorization. Here's what it's for. This is HTTP basic authentication. I'm starting to explain stuff. And then there's the short explanation, which has a link to the whole of the story. So I can annotate my request like this and explain things. This is, already an improvement. I mean, now I can add the explanation that would be necessary. Okay. So let's take this a step further. I realize that this works for the query parameters as well. I mean, I'm going to have to. So this is a different request back from Giphy again, requesting a random cat. I mean, I have to kind of highlight the things because it's a bit messy otherwise. But again, I can do this sort of table of parameters. This was quite easy to kind of put together. I didn't have to try very hard. I didn't really have to write proper sentences. So hypothetically, if I hated writing documentation, this wouldn't have been too much of a struggle. So that's kind of so-so. But I don't like the table very much. And there's one other thing that's bothering me. The authorization header has a name. authorization. The tag parameter has a name. That name is tag. But in this requesting a GIF by ID, this parameter isn't named. So it's the path parameter that's well, it turns out it's the ID of the GIF. So it's not a stretch to say that its name is the kind of the GIF ID, but this is sort of subtly dangerous. I'm introducing a naming problem. And naming is famously hard. So naming during coding is kind of an unavoidable problem. But maybe naming during documentation should be an avoidable problem. Maybe I shouldn't have to deal with that. Also, I don't like the table very much. Anyway, I've still got the table, but at least I can fix this. So the first way to fix this is to just kind of skip the whole name thing and actually just go by example. So now I've got two kind of random IDs, and as long as they look fairly different, I mean, in practice, I'm like, okay, one ends with a W and one ends with a G, so I can kind of see which is which. That kind of works. So, you know, I can cheat and avoid the naming problem, yay. But I've still got this table, and the table is a bit deconstructed and looks a bit like the other docs. But then I thought, what if I didn't actually have to be able to do this in Markdown? Like, what if I could sort of use a fancier tool? Then I could do this. I could just kind of annotate it properly. How would you do it on a whiteboard? On a whiteboard, you wouldn't draw a table underneath the thing and then fill that in. I mean, who would ever get those lines to be straight? It would look rubbish. No, you would just draw an arrow and then just say GIF ID, right? You would just do this. So why can't we do this in the docs as well? When I did this, I looked at it and I thought, no, I can't do this. What's the catch? What's the catch? But it seems to work, and it takes up way less space, which is quite nice. So let's go a bit further here. Here is just a request now for getting a specific GIF. Here's the response. Now the response, as before, is longish. What if do I want to annotate the response as well? No, not sure. I absolutely want to annotate the response, because in this whole response of JSON, there is one really important thing, which is it's the actual image. And I want to see the actual image, right, which is the cat happily writing API documentation, obviously. I mean, we just wouldn't think of doing this in sort of the normal documentation style, but indeed, one of these bits of data is far more interesting than one of the others. And so highlighting it from a sort of information point of view or from a teaching point of view is a fairly sensible thing to do. The other thing that's nice about this, so here's the other example of fetching a random one by tag. I mean, I can just kind of put these arrows anywhere. So I drew this using, you know, presentation tool, word processor would do. I mean, that's not a hard thing. These things all kind of join together as well. These are sort of magic connectors, so I can drag the text around and fiddle with where it is if I want to waste time. This doesn't take up very much space. So this has pretty much all of the information of the original. I'm missing the response here, but that's only this part. And the response would appear here. That wasn't very big. So less space, you know, less to do. This was kind of appealing. In another example with the GitHub API, sometimes there are longer explanations. You know, how does the authentication actually work? If you know enough about HTTP, you might recognize that authorization basic means HTTP basic authorization. You might know what encoding that is, but you still don't know what do I put in there? Not my actual password, obviously, or personal access token. Another example of what you might do if you take this approach further is, you know, if we don't have to be able to do everything in Markdown, you can actually just, well, even you could do this in Markdown. If the response is a binary, then you might as well just inline it, but not talk about it, but actually show it. And this has the advantage that you can then introduce more cute cats into your documentation, which is probably good for the overall happiness of your developers. I should mention, by the way, this is the most important API there is, because this is the placeholder kittens API. well, it's called the CAT API actually by Silo Rivera. They're good for testing and getting pictures of cats. So you should totally use this. As documentation, this is way more accessible to the reader because it's simpler, because it's more direct, because it just points at things. It's also, it turns out, less effort to produce. You start off with the literal session. The tool just gives you that. You just annotate it. You know, you just start off with what is really there, and then you point at things. This is much less effort than deconstructing something. Also, because the deconstruction is very hard to keep consistent. So if you have documentation like the GitHub API with dozens of different URLs, different resources, keeping that sort of documentation consistent, however fancy your tooling is difficult. It's very hard work. I discovered this about a year ago when I started maintaining some documentation like this. And I thought, oh, it's not completely consistent. Let's just clean it up a bit. And I spent ages making all of the HTTP requests and responses and parameter lists kind of correct. It was a whole big job. I almost stopped liking writing documentation.
How would you put errors in this?
So here I'm giving an example of one response. I would just include more examples. So all of the possible errors, I would just have, I mean, this is happy path, and then I would extend the documentation with all of the variations that are interesting and the errors. So the different errors, I would just provide those here. If they were common to lots of requests, I'll probably still want to just include them here. Don't make the reader kind of flip pages just because you want to avoid duplication. It turns out in textbooks, in reference books, duplication is not a bad thing. Duplication is just bad in code. But if you're teaching something, repetition is helpful. If you say something more than once, maybe the message gets across better. See what I just did there?
And this is a landscape to the arguments, right?
Well, you don't know how, no, it goes down to here.
Ah.
Very complex.
I may have cheated. Of course I'm right.
Yeah.
So, I haven't done anything very clever. But what I've done is that I've taken the literal request and response and I've annotated it with parameters, and I've not felt constrained to produce this using Markdown. The purpose of the documentation is to provide the information to teach. It's like textbook material, it's like reference material. There's a whole world of layout and typography, which is kind of important for presenting information. If you don't use that, we're just doing it the hard way. Man pages, it's like, you know, textbooks produced on a typewriter. I mean, that was kind of the state of the art, I don't know, 50 years ago. Actually, it probably wasn't 50 years ago, because all we did then, we still had better things than typewriters. What you can also do is introduce warnings and annotations about unexpected things. And that's when things started to get really interesting. So for the next part of this presentation, I want to time. I'm going to show you what honest API docs might look like. And for this, I'm going to introduce the API, the Dr. Evil API. So this is what happens when you have multiple teams, you start using microservices and you don't want to talk to each other. They have to, they produce the APIs and they document the APIs and they say, we don't have to talk to each other now until we have microservices. But they aren't necessarily nice to each other by way of their microservices. So if you are unlucky enough to have one of your microservice teams run by Dr. Evil, then you will start to see HTTP ugliness. So the advantage, unexpected advantage, actually I should say, of showing the raw HTTP is that you can really see the ugliness. Whereas in traditional HTTP documentation, you don't notice until you start actually coding it. It's all sort of glossed over. Because it's deconstructed, you don't really see the thing. Right? So let's start with some sort of a simple example. Simple example is if you fetch a plan for world domination, as one does. And there's no such evil plan as Plan 42. Then Dr. Evil's API does not return a 404 not found. It just says server error. And the server error gives you the actual error message in some sort of weird encoded way. Right? And obviously it's Dr. Evil's API, so it's obviously XML.
Could have been solved.
It's just
So-
latency there.
Dr. Evil has a technical writer who's feeling some sense of sort of helpfulness, and he's trying to, well, explain as best as possible.
And it's nice, it's a 500 and not a 200.
It could be a lot worse, yeah, indeed. So, I mean, I've got, there's more examples of this, but the idea is the same, is that you can annotate the weird stuff to explain what's going on. So, if I tried to delete a plan for world domination, but it turns out that you are not allowed to delete plans for world domination, or in fact, that obviously deletion would use a post method, not a delete method, because it's not evil. And there's no message for that, but it turns out there is an HTTP status code specifically for you used the wrong HTTP method, or this HTTP method is not allowed. But no, does it use 4 or 5? No, something else. But as you said, at least it doesn't fail silently. Like this, for example. So, what if you missed a parameter and you got something wrong? The request is invalid, of course. You want to get an error because your client code might be checking whether there was an error. And if you're going to do this 200, then your error handling code kind of can't really exist, or at least it has to be funkier and start looking inside. And obviously it's Dr. Evil, so the error code is always 666. But it can get worse than this. It can get a little bit more subtle. So in this example, what's evil about this is that having created an evil plan with a post request and an XML for an evil plan called world domination. That was always called world domination. The response might be a success response and kind of gives a location of the new plan. So what Dr. Evil just did is reinvent redirects. But redirects are already part of HTTP. You could also have a location header. And so one of the evil things that happens, this is a bit more subtle. This is a bit harder to see when somebody's done something that looks kind of okay, but HTTP has a cleaner way of doing that. It's built in. There's a status code, a more specific status code. So this is a success. It is a success code, but there's a more appropriate success code because we created something. When you create something, location header. Another example would be to kind of reinvent the, this is like slightly less bad, but it's still kind of wrong. But we know that the status was supposed to be 201, so we just put it in the JSON response.
But it's clear now. Yeah.
So at this point, the technical writers start getting passive aggressive, and they've given up talking to the developers and saying why, and just start putting this stuff in the documentation. But again, they can just start with what actually happens and then add their comments. Content types are always a source of entertainment for Dr. Evil, because you can say that you only parse JSON responses, but you will still get XML. And your error message will be JSON parse error, unexpected syntax at angle bracket. The first character of your XML response. So, how are you going to parse this? I mean, you can say that you wanted JSON, but realistically, you're just going to have to check what you actually get every single time anyway. You can also even just get random software bugs. So, if you want a list of evil plans, what order are they in? Well, they're in random order, of course. Which order did you want? In software, when you have a list of things, in a response, in a user interface, random order is pretty much always a bug. It's pretty much never the order you want. Highly unlikely to be correct. So don't do this. this is about as bad as it gets. You know, this is my current worst thing I've seen, let's say, relatively recently. I don't want to name names. Mixing encodings. So the response is, so I've got to send, actually, wait, I've got my content type ones here, so my slides are. So, well, my request live, but this is form encoded request. So, X, W, your form encoded. This is what it looks like if you get some JSON and you put it inside a value. You know, plan equals and then JSON. It's very ugly. Now, if you weren't looking at the literal request, you would never see this, because you'd have some deconstructed API documentation that would say request type form encoded. And then there'd be a little note somewhere that would say, oh, the value of the title parameter has to be, or the value of the plan parameter has to be a JSON string. And you have to realize for yourself that that JSON string does need to be encoded. And it's going to be huge if it's a big JSON document, because JSON documents tend to include many quote marks, quotation characters. And those quotation characters all have to be encoded here. What's worse is JSON inside XML, or the other way around, XML inside JSON. Don't do that either. And many times it will seem like, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe it was the quick way to get something done, but sadly. So making these examples was super easy. I had my hypothetical. Actually, this isn't real API, so I did fake it. I just kind of typed it, but you get the idea. To actually then document it, I didn't have to write lots of documentation. The hard part about writing documentation is the words and spaces, and the hard part about maintaining documentation is keeping everything consistent. In this approach, that's kind of easy. This topic is so important that there's a song about it. So your homework for tonight is to go to YouTube and search for this song. Maybe we'll put it on after I finish talking if there's Wi-Fi. So I highly recommend this. So this is the point at which I thought I was sort of done, but I come up with an idea. I mean, there's obviously lots of future things to do, like figure out how to generate it anyway. Can you generate SVG that's going to make the little curves sort of link up and stuff like that? I mean, at least you could put it in a browser, that would work. But this is when I realized that obviously I haven't done anything unique here at all. I've just been inspired by things I'd seen, and eventually I figured out what one of the key inspirations for this was. Back in 2003, Kathy Sierra came up with a book called Head First Java, which was to be the first in a series of Head First books for O'Reilly. Okay. But this is the first one. This is presumably an Indian edition because it says over 1 lakh copies sold. Now, in the Indian English counting scheme, lakh means 100,000. 1 lakh is 100,000. That is a lot of copies of a book. Successful books sell maybe 10,000. This is possibly O'Reilly's best-selling book. Hugely popular, much ridiculed maybe, because it kind of looks like a child's textbook inside. But something important there. And I remember this because the co-author, actually the co-author is Bert Bates, Kathy Sierra's less famous partner. And I worked with Bert on a project a while ago, and he explained what was going on here. That Kathy Sierra looked into the research about teaching and figured out that direct annotation, handwriting style, making it look more like what you would see on the whiteboard, is a very effective teaching technique. There's a reason that it looks like a child's textbook. That's because child's textbooks is really quite an advanced topic. Lots of people work on that. Lots of people use them. It's a thing. I mean, it's been a thing for a lot longer than programming has. So this really works, and it really worked big time for O'Reilly, and there are many of these books. And so that's when I realized, I didn't invent this idea of annotating things and documentation. I mean, it wasn't even invented here, but this is where I kind of seen it. So it's not a weird approach. So maybe the future of documentation is that although things like Markdown files and GitHub repos are an extremely accessible way to kind of publish documentation, and that's a good thing, that lowers the bar, it's in a way a dead end in what it lets you do. because visually and with layout and typography, you can do much more. And technical writers are more ambitious than programmers when it comes to producing the documentation. So there's more to docs than what they usually look like. So I mentioned that I quite like writing documentation, and that's why I like to train on that. And this is all part of a broader topic for me, which is how to kind of make code maintainable and how to kind of understand what's going on. I like to train on that as well. And the very last thing, because I'm now finished, is that there is another O10 in Rotterdam. There's O10 Dev, of which I'm a co-organizer. We have meetups too. So if you were to ever find that O10 PHP events were just not enough for you and you needed something else while waiting for the next O10 PHP event, you should maybe go and check out O10 Dev. Next event in January. Come along. There's nice people. Anyway, thank you very much. Do we want to do Q&A or does everybody just want to go?
I do have a lot of questions actually.
Okay, let's
I
do
was wondering
questions.
what your opinion is of OpenAPI/Swagger.
I hate Swagger. I don't actually hate Swagger. Swagger is not the problem.
No.
But I hate what people do with Swagger. What developers, and by people, I mean developers who hate writing documentation and who somehow fantasize that documentation can be generated. What they do is they run Swagger and then have this fantasy that they have just created documentation. They have not. If you create documentation by running Swagger, you've just created a different layout of the code. You've just got a different representation. What you typically then didn't do was write enough words and spaces. Now, Swagger does support all of those words and spaces. And if you look at the Swagger examples on their website, it's pet store or something, and there's all this kind of text in there that explains what it's for. And that looks great. And there's all this explanation of the response representations and stuff like that. If you look at typical actual Swagger documentation in the wild, it tends to not have those sentences. It tends to be a bit empty. But if nothing else, the answer to Swagger is this. Consider all of the SaaS companies like GitHub or Spotify or Twilio or whatever, who sell services for which there is an API, and part of what you're paying for is the API. How many of them use Swagger for their public documentation for their API? It's a dead end. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part about Swagger, so I will continue, because, I mean, I should just have slides on Swagger, but it was send me off into a whole other round, which I'm now going to do anyway, is that if you, and I have had this conversation where we say, right, we need some API documentation. And then the developer says, oh, let's set up Swagger. And then they proceed to spend days or weeks on basically documentation avoidance. Because playing with Swagger is just a way of avoiding actually writing the documentation. You know, oh no, but we can annotate the code and I'll make a thing that will turn the annotations into the JSON that Swagger needs, you know, generate the documentation. All time that is not spent writing words and spaces. So the actual most dangerous thing about Swagger is that it is a way of avoiding doing what you should be doing. It's like the tidying your room of documentation.
I think it's funny because I use the exactly the other way around. So the past few weeks of working with like a front-end developer and a backender, and we use the OpenAPI spec as a contract between us two. Okay. So then we have a contract, we agree on request responses, and then he writes the partner to the partner. Later on, we can plug it together and it works. Or another example is you've got Tiki, which is from the ABN AMRO Bank. They have parts like explanatory documentation, like all words, and an API spec in Swagger that you can use to generate your own clients. So for me, that's actually very beneficial. But I agree that generating documentation code is not a good thing.
Yeah. So what I take away from that is that having a specification, especially for developing the clients, is maybe a useful thing. And Swagger is maybe a useful way of visualizing that specification. Yeah. But this strikes me as a different scenario to somebody who's published an API that I want to then use as a developer. So maybe do what you're doing and not use this as an excuse for having crap documentation, which is not what you're doing. Another question.
Have you found that writing the documentation that you suggest actually would improve the API? Or because, I mean, if everything is just out there, all the ugliness and all the other stuff.
Potentially. So I maintain some API docs for which I've done some experimentation with this style.
Mhm.
And in doing so, I created quite a few Jira tickets
Mhm.
for the maintainers of the API itself. After having sort of noticed some things that could be improved. So yeah, at least it has the potential to make the API better. I mean, it doesn't make the API better unless you actually fix the things,
Yeah.
but it highlights things that need fixing. So, I mean, seeing problems is a good first step in a more wholesome, better API experience. But it takes more than just seeing problems. But I'm optimistic
Yeah.
that it would help.
Do you have a open source project or something where you have implemented this type of documentation?
Yeah, where you generate the curly stuff.
Especially the generation part, right? Now, do you have something that we can take a look at, like we can share it on Slack and Twitter?
I don't, only these slides, which are on my website,
Of course.
on the presentations. No, this is such a new idea that this has not yet been applied in practice in open source projects. It would be a super great idea to just rewrite all of GitHub's documentation to be like this, but that would take longer than the weekend. So,
Like maybe just 2 weekends then.
yeah, maybe.
I mean, the holidays are coming up.
And a
year.
slight caveat here. I mean, everything I told you this evening, I just made up. And I have proven, and I haven't really tried it out properly on a complete set of API documentation. So it's just possible that if we actually did this, it would turn out to be a bad idea.
Maybe.
It's there may be something I just didn't find in my simplified examples. Some reason why it doesn't work. But I'm confident that this is the best idea in API documentation ever.
So maybe you just have to create some project with some souls that can help you with writing some examples then.
You don't really need any help in writing examples because you just need any HTTP client that will let you do a request and capture the request and response. And then you add a title, one sentence description, and you start annotating things.
Well, if you have like, if you give it like, make a markdown make an extension of markdown that you can annotate it that way, then have the curly breaks and stuff or lines.
Yeah.
Build it.
Yeah. How about just no? So
About
who has ever designed one of these roll-up banners? Has only ever designed and sent one of these?
I
to print?
tried and I
What?
failed.
Is that because you tried to do it in Markdown?
No.
I mean, this is entirely my point. When you produce one of these, such as this one here, this was almost certainly designed in Adobe Illustrator, and if not in Illustrator, in a similar tool.
Paint, yeah.
The vector graphics are telling me that it probably wasn't right, but you get the idea. This fixation on generating things from code is fine if what you're trying to generate from code is running software, because that's how we make software, by writing code. But there are other things in the world you do not make by writing code. I mean, it's shocking, I know. But if that's the way you try and produce everything, sometimes you're doing it the hard way. But with documentation and roll-up banners, that's the hard way. And there are tools that are really good at this. Like the desktop publishing revolution really happened. Has been ongoing for 30 years now.
Wow.
Okay.
Any more questions? I mean, I'm assuming we won't get kicked out just yet.
No.
So you can now come after you can come and ask me the questions you're too shy to ask them from everybody else.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you for being good.
Thank you very much.